John from theproductivegarden.com, and today I'm just going to do a bit of a sort of frequently asked questions about worm farms. I get a few questions about worm farms in my videos, so I thought I would cover those that get most commonly asked. Excuse me. Okay, so one of those ones I get commonly asked is about other bugs and stuff in the worm farm, beetle larvae and that sort of thing. And they're actually quite common in a worm farm, even though like a worm farm only includes worms in its title. Lots of other things are normal and actually quite beneficial. In a worm farm you get lots of little sort of reddy brown, little beastly tiny little pin dot things in there. You get soldier fly larvae, and all those things are fine. They're often a bit of a sign, especially soldier fly larvae can be a bit of a sign that you're starting to get a bit too much food in there. So it's often good to see them. They won't do any harm to your worm farm, but once you see them, take it as a sign that you're putting a bit too much food in there. The food input should just go down a bit, just so that your worms are consuming it as they go. And lots of other things in there are just fine. If you get anything that, like if you start getting maybe, like if you get any rodents in there, certainly that's a problem, and it means that you've got a problem with them getting access to it. But other insects and larvae and that sort of thing aren't really that much of a problem unless they start to take over, and if anything they're a bit of a sign that you're putting too much food in. Okay, so that's the thing with with other insects in your worm farm. I wouldn't worry about them too much, but just see them as a sign as perhaps you're putting too much food in. The other question I get asked is about putting earthworms, just normal earthworms out of your garden, into the worm farm. Now, they'll still, they'll go fine in your worm farm, they'll eat the food and all that sort of stuff. Normal earthworms tend to like to go a lot deeper in the worm farm than composting worms. So you might have a problem with them not liking how shallow it is compared to what they normally like. They also eat food a lot slower than what composting worms do, so you won't get the production of vermicasts and also the worm juice and that sort of stuff as quickly as what you would with composting worms. Now, a way of harvesting composting worms that might work if you've got them in your area is to put a pile of wet leaves, cardboard, shredded paper or something like that on top of the soil. Leave it there for a few days, maybe even a week, depending upon how many worms you've got, and try to attract them to that area. Then you should be able to lift that up and harvest composting worms that way. You'll tend to get composting worms rather than earthworms in that sort of environment, because that's what they're looking for. They're looking for mulch on top of the composting worms, that is, are looking for mulch on top of the soil, that's sitting on top of the soil, and that's what they want to get into and eat that, and then they bring it down into the surface of the soil, and that's where it puts the goodness into the soil. So that's one way of getting them if you can't pay for them. Okay, and there are some places I know that in the Caribbean there can be a bit of a problem finding people who actually sell earthworms. So that can be one way you can get them if they are in your area, and certainly if you do that you'll get composting worms that are native to your environment as well. So they should do a lot better in your weather conditions as well. Okay. Okay, the other thing that I get asked a lot is about worms escaping from the worm farm. Now, it's pretty normal that when you put the bins together that you'll get earthworms come up between the bins, and sometimes they go outside, and it's just a normal, it's like any animal. They're going to see if there's any further they can range to see if they can find a better source of food. We do it. If a new restaurant opens, we go and check out that new restaurant. That's just a normal, you'll see a new source of food, you're going to check it out and see what it's like. So yeah, that's just what they're doing, and if they find that there's no food within easy reach, so if they get out of the bin, they find that it's too cold or it's too dry and all that sort of stuff, they'll generally go back in. And if you lose some, you're not going to lose a whole lot. If there is a problem and you've got them just leaving en masse and they're just not coming back, then you need to look at the environment inside the worm farm. Is it too dry? Is it too wet? Is there not enough food? Is there too much food? Okay, so if you've got any of those things happening, then you just need to fix those things up, and then you'll have your worm farm staying. I've had my worm farm going for, must be 18 months now, and I haven't added any worms other than the worms I initially put in there. I haven't added any worms to that worm farm, and it's been going continuously ever since then. So, and I have worms that occasionally come out, and I find worms dry on the decking next to where they sit on my back veranda. But I've still got heaps of worms in there. They go through a good amount of food, and yeah, they'd be no problem at all. So you shouldn't really have a problem with worms escaping and losing population within your worm farm, anything significant anyway. The other question I get asked is about the position of worm farms, where you should put them, and what you should do when really cold winter temperatures really hit, like freezing temperatures where you have snow and that sort of thing. So positioning of the worm farm, firstly, is you should position it where you get shade all the time. Okay, you don't want it sitting in sun and getting hot. If the worm farm gets hot, it'll kill the worms, it'll cook them, and if it gets hot and maybe over a couple of days you forget to add some moisture to it if it needs it, then the worms are going to dry out and again they're going to die. So you want somewhere in the shade where it's going to stay nice and cool. If you've got a basement situation, they can be a good place for it. But basically in the southern hemisphere where I am, you want them on the south side of the house. That's where you're going to get shade in the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, the US, Europe, Canada, places like that, then you want them on the northern side of the house. That's where you're going to get shade all the time. Now in winter time, when you get freezing temperatures, then you need to put them somewhere where the worm farm isn't going to freeze. So if it gets covered in snow, it's going to freeze the worm farm, it's going to freeze the worms, and they're going to die. So that's when you want them somewhere inside, somewhere protected in a basement or somewhere like that, in a shed, somewhere where they're going to be protected from those freezing temperatures and not freeze to death. Okay, so that's about where we should put the worms. Okay, and that's it. That's the last one, is with worm tea. How long does it take to get it? Sure. Yeah, or second last one is, how long does it take to get worm tea? Okay, so it can depend on what you're feeding the worms. Okay, how long it takes to get it. If you're feeding them lots of vegetable scraps that are high in moisture, then you'll get it very quickly. You'll get worm tea very quickly. Also, it depends upon how wet the bedding is inside the worm farm. Okay, so just have, if you're having trouble getting some through, then maybe just sprinkle half a cup of water per day on the worm farm, as long as it's not too soggy. And basically it should be, as I've said before, if you get a pile of castings, they should be damp, but if you squeeze them, you shouldn't be squeezing any water out of it. So if you're squeezing water out of it, you're getting too much moisture in there. But yeah, generally, if the worms are active, they put lots of holes, they move the worm castings around, and water should drain through fairly quickly, and that can speed up the process of getting worm tea at first. It'll also depend upon how high you put the valve. So if you put the valve perhaps a little bit higher, not as low as what you could have, then you're going to take a while for the worm tea to get up to the level where it can come out of the valve, because it's got to fill the container up to the level of the valve, and that's when you'll start getting worm tea coming out. Okay, there are ways that you can get it right out from the bottom. You can have a little elbow in there that goes down to the bottom, and there are ways you can set up a sort of suction, a siphoning effect, but it's just more effort than I think you need. If you can just wait for it to fill up to the valve, then you'll get worm tea out of there. The other thing is about putting things like chili, garlic, citrus, onions, those sorts of things in there. Now, the worms will tolerate a little bit of that in there, especially if it's mixed in with other stuff, but not a whole lot at all. It's not true, like some people say you should never put citrus in there, you should never put garlic, never put chili, never put those things. Well, they will eventually break down, and I have like sometimes half a lemon in there. If I've squeezed lemon in tea or something like that, a whole half lemon will just go into the worm farm with the worms, and yeah, it takes a little while, but after a while it just becomes part of the worm castings, just like everything else. It's definitely not their favourite, but once it breaks down, you'll get it. Like the fungus will break it down first, and then the worms will get in there after the acidity's gone, and they'll do it. It's fine. It's not going to kill the worms and that sort of thing. It's just the last thing that they want to eat. So yeah, things like that are fine to put in there, as long as it's not too much, and it's definitely got to be the minority amongst the scraps that you put in there. Otherwise, they just won't like the environment in there. It'll be too acid for them. And another question that I've just sort of then is commonly asked is how long you should leave the worm farm before you put worms in there. Well, you can put worms in there straight away. You don't need to let the bedding settle or anything like that. You put, like I like to use the coconut core rather than peat, because it's more sustainable than peat. So put the coconut core in there, put your worms in there, put a little bit of food scraps on top, and that's it. You're ready to go with your worm farm. Okay, anyway, I hope you have enjoyed those questions and got something from them. And if you have any other questions, definitely leave them in the comments down below, and I'll endeavour to do my best to answer them. Okay, and thanks for watching. And until next time, happy productive gardening. Bye.